Now, as we touched on earlier on this afternoon, we mentioned the European Arrest Warrant, an absolutely heinous piece of legislation, and I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Mr. Mark Turner, who's going to talk about the experiences of him and his son regarding this. Mark.
Oh, good afternoon. Can you hear me in the posh seats or in the lounge bar? I'll try without the microphone. Can you hear me at the back? Yes. Okay, we'll try. Just before I start, I did actually, got a little snippet, saw a bit of news, because I run a pub, so I don't see a lot of television, but I managed to see a bit of news which said that apparently UKIP had done rather well in last week's elections. So I just think it's important to point out, because what I'm going to talk about has been going on for some considerable time, and during that time, I think it's important for people to be able to pat themselves on the back, but to realise that things don't just happen. People make things happen, and you are those people, so well done everybody.
Mark, you dropped your voice.
Okay. How's that?
Wow.
Better. Fantastic. Okay, before the enlargement of the EU, prior to, I think it was 2004, my son and his former business partner ran a small business in Hungary. They saw it as an emerging market and a land of opportunity. They worked there in what turned out to be probably certainly one of the most corrupt financial environments in Europe, and their business sadly failed and cost them their life savings in 2005. They returned from Hungary with absolutely nothing and started to rebuild their lives. In 2008, in the autumn of 2008, I was on holiday with my family in the Canary Islands when I had a phone call from my son, panicking, saying that he'd just heard they'd issued a European Arrest Warrant for him and that they were trying to get him extradited back to Budapest to stand trial on charges of fraud. Having decided that he'd left 18,000 euros of creditors behind when the business failed, and they decided to make these creditors into victims of fraud, so that they, in Hungary, a criminal action would then mean he would have had to personally repay the creditors. Anyway, I said I would assist him by flying back from the Canary Islands. In the meantime, I suggested he went to see our local solicitor and take some legal advice. By the time I arrived back to the Canary Islands, I learned that, in fact, nobody's going to help you. There was no local solicitor. When I say local, I wasn't just referring to the village of Corfe Castle where we live, or the Isle of Purbeck, or Swanage, or Wareham. Not even Poole or Bournemouth. There wasn't one firm of solicitors who would entertain assisting him, no matter how much money he was prepared to offer them. It turns out you need a firm of solicitors, very few of which exist, that are based in London, big practices based in London. The only courts in the land that will hear these cases was only one court, and that's Westminster Magistrates Court. And from there, the High Court in the Strand. So if you're on a low budget or have no money at all, you're going to find this very difficult. And in fact what they do is they throw you into Wandsworth Prison and leave you there while the process is underway. So the first shock came that we didn't know what it was, no local solicitors had any understanding of it and wouldn't get involved in it. We tried to oppose what was happening, and during a process that took more than 1 year, we were continuously backwards and forwards from London, everything from bail applications, trying to keep him out of prison, to trying to reject the iron claw of the Hungarian judiciary. We hired a human rights barrister and ended up in the High Court in the Strand, and he argued that in fact that there was to be no trial in Hungary, that there hadn't even been an investigation, a proper investigation against my son, that this was commercially motivated, and that my son, if he went to Hungary, would just be locked up in prison and basically held to ransom until somebody paid enough money. And one of my great shocks was when Justice Collins in the High Court turned round to this highfalutin human rights barrister and said, "Now, come along, Mr. Donoghue, you know I can't listen to your arguments because I am directed from Brussels on these matters." Well, I thought, well, that's that, isn't it? And his barrister said to him, "I think you're going to have to face the fact that you've got a one-way ticket to hell. You're going to Budapest." My son asked what would happen to him. Nobody in the court knew. They said, "You just have to report to Gatwick Airport, the Malab Airlines desk at 4 p.m. on Friday," which he did, and he drove his own car because he's never one to flout the law. He's never even had a speeding ticket. When he got to Gatwick Airport and was met by a member of Interpol and greeted by SOCA, the Serious and Organised Crimes Agency, who on their website say they specialise in people trafficking, drug dealers, international firearms smuggling and all this sort of thing. They're the people who handed over my son to a bunch of Hungarian thugs dressed in jeans and black t-shirts, who, when the ITV news cameras tried to film them, started to put on balaclava masks. The Interpol agent said, no, you don't have to worry because they're only going to Budapest, they're not leaving Europe, and when they arrive, they'll be telephoning you, they'll tell you where they are, that they're well, because that's their right. So I had a lonely trip back to Corfe Castle and sat and waited for the phone to ring. And surprise, surprise, it didn't ring. I heard nothing, and I didn't hear anything the next day either. So now trying to find somebody when this has happened is very difficult. I contacted the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, I contacted the embassies, and they all reported back to me and said, no, we've spoken to the Hungarians and they've assured us that they have not detained any British citizens and they know nothing about them. So we appointed a Budapest lawyer and asked him if he could find them. Eventually he found them, but the Hungarian authorities wouldn't give him any access to them. They said, no, you have no mandate to represent these people, so you're not their lawyer. And he said, well, if you let me see them, I'll get them to sign the relevant paperwork. No, because we're not letting you see them because you haven't got the right relevant paperwork. They then moved them to another prison. I now know that talking to my son afterwards and eventually getting to see him, that what actually happened when he got there was that they were handcuffed so tightly that when they arrived at the police station, they had blood running from their wrists. They were led across the airport lounge in front of the other guests on a dog lead and dragged into a waiting police car, hurried away. When they asked to speak to the British consulate, they were just scorned and laughed upon and said, they don't want to speak to the likes of you. They were held what their lawyer called incognito. I made complaints back here in the UK to solicitors who said there was nothing they could do about it. We needed to speak to lawyers in Budapest. Lawyers in Budapest said, well, that's just how they do things over here. So I made complaints to our then Member of Parliament, Lord Knight he is now, Jim Knight, Lord Knight, who was a Right Honourable as well. And he said, well, there's nothing I can do. It's a judicial matter. We can't interfere. So I was on my own, wondering what to do, feeling fairly low, and the phone rang, and I picked it up, and it was a man called William Dartmouth. And he said, I've just heard what's happened to your son. He said, you're going to need some assistance. And we got together and things looked up from there. And I will say he was such a brave, stalwart individual. He actually flew to Budapest and met with the Hungarian Justice Minister and explained how we British people do business, and told him the Hungarians, they should be ashamed of themselves and so on. And then following a long and hard diplomatic battle both here and in Brussels, eventually William was there to greet my son when he flew back into Gatwick Airport 4 months later. 4 months later, and he still hadn't been charged with anything. There was no trial. There was absolutely nothing. And incidentally, in case anybody is wondering, they drag you all across Europe and take you wherever they want to, but they never bring you home again. They just throw you out in the streets one day, and you've got nothing except a mobile phone which you had when you went, but the battery's now gone flat or whatever, and they don't care if you don't have tuppence in your pocket. You're just left on the far side of Europe to wander the streets. I have, through this process as well, met other people who have been victims of these warrants. People like Edmund Arapi, who was coming back through Gatwick Airport after having been on holiday with his family, to be arrested and taken away, and his family told to stand back because their father or the husband, whatever, was in fact a convicted murderer and was wanted in Italy for some sort of mafia crimes. So he was immediately incarcerated in Wandsworth Prison. Couldn't possibly be given bail because he was a murderer on the run, and he was going off to Italy to serve a life sentence, 27 years in fact. There could be no appeal because the trial in Italy had already been held, even though he wasn't there. They held it in absentia because they do this a lot in Europe. And not only that, they'd had an appeal, and the lawyers that the state appointed to represent him in his absence had then appealed it. And he was still convicted, and there would be no court appearance in Italy because he just had to go and serve the sentence. And of course he didn't speak Italian. He'd never even been to Italy. So that's where he was going to be spending most of the rest of his life. And it was only after a big intervention by the Home Secretary, because the press at the time kicked up a big stink, because his claims he'd never even been to Italy, that checking with the Italian prosecutor's office and some DNA samples, they found that in fact it was a completely different person. It was just a case of mistaken identity, that somebody in the field of organised crime had used his identity at random and left that evidence behind so that some random person on the other side of Europe would appear to be the perpetrator of a crime. And all by the skin of his teeth, he would have spent the rest of his life rotting in an Italian prison. I met a young lady called Deborah Dark, who was surprised one day when she went on holiday to be arrested. She was by now a grandmother and had her daughter and grandchild with her, was arrested in Spain, taken to a top security prison in Madrid, where she was driven by armed guards who, when they stopped halfway and went for dinner, left her handcuffed in the back of the car. She was beaten very badly in this prison. Her eye socket was broken. She was left partially sighted, and eventually she was released. And it turned out that 20 years previously, in her younger days, she'd been on trial in France, where she'd been acquitted because it was a drug smuggling case, and her then boyfriend had been involved in some wrongdoings, but the court was convinced it was clearly nothing to do with her and had released her and dismissed the case. But some considerable years later, they decided to try her again in absentia without telling her, so she wasn't represented, and then convicted her. And then, because they could issue a European arrest warrant, they issued the warrant to have her arrested and returned to France to serve a prison sentence that she knew nothing about. And that was, in fact, 20 years after the event. There were others. I met many others going through that system. It's an awful, oppressive system. And the thing is that there is nobody that will stand up against it. Now, my son now is back in the UK, and that's fantastic. They had a fantastically politically motivated trial, which he attended. William Dartmouth was present, as was Richard Drax, in fact. Both were insulted in the courtroom by the Hungarian authorities, but that's another story. But at the end of it, the judge summed up saying, well, I appreciate that you're not criminals. I appreciate that you're not criminals, and you never came here to commit any crime. But I have to find you guilty. So, following that through an appeal process, which all in all cost over £100,000, we got nowhere. His lawyer said, well, of course, this is because Michael, my son, had given evidence to 2 parliamentary committees. From that, the Hungarian ambassador had been summoned to appear before the Select Committee for Home Affairs and explain Hungary's actions, and was criticised that in all these years, by now it's 7 years of investigation, of incarceration and extradition, there had been no charges against my son. Well, 1 month later, an indictment arrived. They soon put that to rights. And now he's back here, and he's still fighting to clear his name, and we're off to this famous European Court of Human Rights. Here's many thousands of pounds later again. His lawyer has advised us we have to be careful going to this court, because if the outcome of the court is deemed against the interests of the European Union, it will probably be ruled as inadmissible, and the judges will refuse to listen to the case. So we have to watch the space to see where that goes next. My feelings, I mean, I thank everybody here for their actions in standing up to this European Union. I think sometimes people forget we feel comfortable today, we've got some good food in our tummies, a nice glass of wine, and everything feels harmonious. And I think that we have to have the sight to look forward, not to how life is today, but what will it be like in a generation's time? Who are the people who are not yet born, and what sort of world will they see in Europe? And I think that the only thing that I give hope for is that, you know, more than 10 years ago, when somebody planted those little acorns, those saplings are growing, and we all know what acorns grow into. And as I started, when I spoke earlier and I began, and I said that, you know, people make things happen, and in a sense now, you are those oak trees. So thank you to everybody.
Thank you very much, Mark. Very moving, and I think if anybody ever wonders what we're fighting against with the EU, I think you've got a very graphic representation there. So, Marilyn.
Perhaps Mark would just tell us what actually happened to his son and business partner in the prison, and the way they were treated. Horrendous.
How is Jason?
Jason's life. Jason's okay. I mean, he's not physically damaged, but his life has gone downhill. Of course, when he was extradited, he was a top executive with a famous Midlands company, and of course he lost his job. Then came the divorce and separation from his family, and so on. So life does go downhill, but I mean, physically he's okay. Conditions inside the prison where they were held, it was which William Dartmouth actually went and inspected, and could tell his own stories of, but it was they were with good company, because it's the prison where, after the 1956 uprisings, the Prime Minister at the time and his entire cabinet were executed and buried face down in the grounds. So with their hands tied with barbed wire, as they found them after the fall of the Berlin, the Iron Curtain. But it's a high security prison he was in. He was on the 7th floor. He shared a small space with 4 of them, 3 Romanian gypsies, where he couldn't speak Hungarian, so all the signs, all the language was Hungarian. And whenever the guards would enter the prison, they would shout at him. He wasn't sure what they were saying, because obviously they were speaking Hungarian. And eventually he said he developed sort of an affinity with deaf people, because when he couldn't understand what they were saying, they just shouted louder. And then they would point at signs, and you could just imagine in Hungarian they were saying, well, can't you read? Pointing at Hungarian signs. But life was tough in there. He lost when I first got to see him, after he'd been missing for about 2 months, and he'd lost about 2.5 stone in weight, was looking very withdrawn. They weren't allowed to exercise. You weren't even allowed to walk up and down the cell to do a press-up. Exercise was forbidden. I presume that was because it made people more manageable. but they would do things like come in and raid into the cells. Everybody would have to strip naked, go into the corridors and squat down naked in the corridors and so on. There was these prisons are not like our prisons. If you haven't got anything, you have to do without. When you go in there, you've got a little cup and a washing up bowl, and that washing up bowl is your life, because that's what you have to use for washing. But because they don't give you any soap, you wash your own clothes in this little bowl, but they don't give you any soap powder. If you can't get that brought into you, you just do without it. And when you're living with these Romani gypsies, they have nothing. They have no outside support unit, so it was not a very pleasant place to be at all. And the food there, they'd get for breakfast, and we had a little bowl of liquid pork fat and some stale bread and this sort of thing. So the place was full of bugs and whatever. It would drop on you in the middle of the night and bite you to death and goodness knows what. So it was a very unpleasant place. And also I learned Hungary has no regard for the rules of the European Union. They just take. You know, when they get money sent to them every day, they love this idea of the European Union, but they have no regard for its rules. The prison was racially segregated. Now, the prison argued, well, we do this because it keeps, you know, we have a more manageable environment, it causes less concerns. But they have white ethnic Hungarians on one floor, and then they'll have like Romani gypsies and foreigners on another floor, and they keep the two separate. Actually, there's no exercise yard there. You exercise on the rooftop of the building. There's a big cage built. The building is 7 stories high. There's a cage on the above the 7th floor, and you're let out into the cage for an hour a day, which is an unsupervised area, and from the descriptions I've heard from it, a very frightening place to be. Now, when my son arrived there, it was heading into winter. It was November when he arrived. By the time he arrived in this environment in December, the temperature on the ground was already -13. And when you're on the above a 7th floor building and the wind's whistling through there, with the wind chill factor, it must have been well below -20. And all he had was the ambient summer clothes that he'd left with, because they don't provide you with any clothes. So that made life, you know, even more difficult. It was a really tough time for them. And Jason had the worst. He had 2 self-confessed murderers that he was sharing, mass murderers as well, not just, you know, isolated incidents, professional killers he was sharing a cell with. And they quickly removed everything you have of any value at all. They even took his spectacles from him so that he couldn't read, his wristwatch, anything. Photographs of his family, absolutely everything they take of the other prisoners steal from you. And his lawyer, they are so bureaucratic, his lawyer couldn't even get a new pair of spectacles for Jason. In the end, he had to wear a pair and pretend they were his, bumping into things to go in. And then when he put them down, Jason was able to pick them up and take them from the desk. They trying to get any information or into them or out from them was more or less impossible. My son was there for 4 months, and in that time, nobody managed to get him any material, so he couldn't get a newspaper. Even the embassy couldn't get a newspaper. He wasn't allowed an English-Hungarian dictionary. Nobody could get one of those into him. He learnt that the Hungarian people lie. They just lie all the time, because I couldn't understand it, but apparently the journalists over there explained to me that that's what it was like. The fear under the socialist communist regime was such, where you were questioned all the time, you had to give the right answers. So, for example, if somebody said to them, I'm going to pass you a blue plate, they would actually pass you a red plate and say, here's your blue plate. Because if the authorities had told them they're passing you, that's what it was. It had to be whatever somebody said. And even when the most obvious things were not true, they would just say it anyway. He was there when a member of the British consulate was at a meeting in the prison with Michael after they'd had complaints that Michael had not been able to make contact with the consulate. And the British consul said to the prison guard, who was speaking English, Michael has asked for the rules of the prison in English, why haven't you provided them for him? They said, oh, we can't do that because we don't have them in English. And the British consul said, but I've just met another English prisoner who had the rules of the prison in English given to him by you. And he went, well, I can't comment on that. And they just lie all the time, which is quite unusual, because British people always just want to do the, you know, we'd hate to think that we were going to deliberately tell a lie. But no, they lie all the time. They lied, their embassy lied to cabinet ministers in England, quite blatantly lied. And there's somewhere a famous letter from Richard Drax to the Hungarian ambassador, telling them what he thought of their lies. But but it was a tough time for them in there. And Michael, my son, he was a happy-go-lucky, gregarious young man when he went over there. He'll never be the same again. Now, the thing is, he always drinks black coffee now, doesn't want any sugar, doesn't want any milk, because he's always worried that, maybe there'll be a time when he won't be able to have it again. So he's better off if he just don't have things. He's a minimalist now. But thank you very much for asking.
We've just got time for one more question if there is one. Ben?
Yeah, I'd like to say thank you very much for sharing your story, and clearly you've got a list of stories like that as well in addition, and their accounts atrocious enough to spell the end, what should be the end for the European Arrest Warrant. However, when this enters into a public debate, as it did between Nick Clegg and Nigel Farage, Nick Clegg plays the devil's advocate and he says, well, there are a few positive cases in which the European Arrest Warrant has been used. You referenced the case of the paedophile who went to France with I think a 16-year-old in his class and so forth. How, without having to use what is clearly a fabulously, amazingly strong argument of all the atrocious cases that have taken place, how do we respond, obviously to the rest of the panel, how do we respond to the accusation that we're going to lose, for example, those positive cases, those powers to do good in Europe? Clearly, we put an end to this, but we also need to cover the other bases as well.
I've heard this debated many times, and the answer is quite simple, that we already had protocols, we already have Interpol, we already have all these things available. Modern police forces, modern information communication systems are, you cannot just walk around anonymously now. The serious criminals who are involved in drug running, guns trafficking, they do it anyway, right? It's only that the ordinary person now is not anonymous wandering around, and they have the ways and means. We don't need a European arrest warrant so that foreign police forces can just pick people up and take them across to the other side of Europe. It's far too big, it's far too removed, and these systems are completely alien from each other.
Yeah. Can I just add to that remarkable tale, saga, actually. The EU are proposing, the commissioners have proposed, therefore it's bound to happen, a Euro police force, Europol. They will in future come to this country to carry out the arrest. And they're going to be armed, and we have no jurisdiction over them whatsoever. And once one of these Europols come over here, how do we insist that he goes back again? Because he's an EU official. They're getting themselves into an awful lot of problems. But you're absolutely right, Ben. There are existing forms. The fact that lawyers can take 6 months through an ordinary extradition process is merely a delaying tactic, I would suggest. But the real point is there are existing measures to extradite people from one country to another. And we are the only country that requires prima facie cases before you can be incarcerated. The rest of Europe don't. You have to prove your innocence after you're arrested. So Britain, we're old fuddy-duddies when it comes to the law, because our laws were set in the 12th century with the Magna Carta.
Yeah.
And that's the basis of what makes Britain and the British people different from the rest of Europe.
Well, as I said before, thank you all for coming. Thank you to David for speaking, and of course to Mark as well. I hope you enjoyed this afternoon, and thank you, and hopefully see you again.